The metallic hull of the rust bucket groaned as Kale navigated through the debris field of Xylos. This desolate planet at the edge of the outer rim had become his sanctuary, his self-imposed exile from civilization that had nothing left to offer him. The vast junkyard of abandoned spacecraft stretched for miles beneath the perpetually overcast sky, a graveyard of metal where Kale made his living. Kale adjusted his breathing apparatus and checked the structural integrity readings on his wrist monitor. At 43, his face weathered by cosmic radiation and hardship, he had the appearance of a man who had seen too much and chosen to forget most of it. The military insignia tattooed on his forearm, deliberately faded but never completely removed, was the only hint of his former life. "Looks like a decent haul today," he muttered to no one, a habit formed after years of solitude. The scanner had picked up a cluster of potentially valuable materials in what appeared to be the remnants of a luxury cruiser. Those always had the best components, high-grade alloys, and sometimes even intact technology that fetched good prices at the trading outpost. The Rust Bucket, despite its unflattering name, was a reliable vessel. Originally a mid-sized cargo ship, Kale had modified it extensively over the years, turning it into both home and livelihood. It wasn't pretty with its mismatched hull plates and exposed wiring in some corridors, but it was sturdy and, most importantly, it was his. As he maneuvered closer to the crashed cruiser, his proximity sensors began to flash. Something was interfering with the readings. Kale frowned, adjusting the settings. That's odd. The life sign detector was registering a faint, irregular pattern. In his 15 years of salvaging, he'd encountered many things in the wrecks. Automated systems still running decades after their owners had abandoned ship, indigenous creatures making homes in the metal carcasses, and once, a group of pirates using a wreck as an ambush point. But a life sign this faint was unusual, especially in a wreck that, judging by the corrosion patterns, had been here for at least several months. Kale debated whether to investigate. The smart move would be to ignore it. Strange readings usually meant trouble, and trouble meant either danger or, at best, a waste of time. But something about the irregularity of the signal tugged at his curiosity. "Damn it," he sighed, reaching for his equipment bag. He strapped on his utility belt with its assortment of tools, checked his hand blaster, set to stun, always his first approach, and made sure his emergency medical kit was complete. It had been a while since he'd needed to use it on anything other than himself. The airlock hissed as he stepped out onto the surface of Xylos. The gravity was slightly lower than standard, giving his movements a subtle bounce that had taken months to get used to when he'd first arrived. The cruiser lay half-buried in the dusty ground, its elegant lines now broken and twisted, telling the story of a violent descent. Kale approached cautiously, scanner in one hand, blaster in the other. The entry point was obvious, a massive tear in the hull, likely from impact with debris during the crash. The edges had been smoothed by months of exposure to Xylos's abrasive atmosphere. As he climbed inside, his helmet light illuminated the devastation. What had once been a luxury interior was now a chaos of broken panels, exposed circuitry, and scattered personal belongings. The life sign was coming from deeper within, past what appeared to have been a recreational area. The ship groaned ominously as he made his way forward, stepping carefully over debris. Every few meters, he paused to listen and check his scanner. The life sign was growing stronger, but remained erratic. He reached a sealed door, or rather, one that had been sealed at some point, but now showed signs of having been forced open. Beyond it lay crew quarters, and, as his light swept the room, he noticed signs of habitation more recent than the crash. Makeshift containers holding collected rainwater, food wrappers from standard emergency rations, and a crude alarm system made from salvage parts. Someone had been surviving here. His scanner led him to a small maintenance crawl space, the kind used to access environmental systems. The opening had been widened and crude defenses set up around it, sharpened metal and an improvised electrical deterrent currently disabled. "Hello," Kale called out, keeping his voice as non-threatening as possible. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Kale. I'm a salvager." Silence. His scanner indicated the life sign was just beyond that opening, but there was no response. Kale hesitated, then made a decision. He deactivated the remaining defenses with practiced ease. Whoever had built them had been clever but lacked technical training, and shone his light into the space. Huddled in the far corner, surrounding herself with whatever scraps of protection she could find, was a young female figure unlike any Kale had seen before. Her skin had a subtle iridescent quality, shifting between pale blue and green even in the limited light. Large, almond-shaped eyes reflected his light like a nocturnal animal's. She appeared humanoid in basic structure, but her fingers were longer, with an extra joint, and what he had initially taken for hair was actually a crown of delicate, feathery appendages that now lay flat against her skull in obvious fear. She was a Sylvan. Kale had heard of them, but never encountered one personally. They were a reclusive species from the far reaches of the Andromeda Galaxy, known for their empathic abilities and natural affinity for both organic and technological systems. And she was just a child, or at least appeared to be a juvenile by her species standards. Perhaps the equivalent of 14 or 15 in human years, though it was always difficult to tell with non-human species. She was also clearly injured. Dark, viscous fluid that he assumed was her equivalent of blood had dried on her side, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Dehydration had left her skin looking dull and papery in places. The natural luminescence Sylvans were known for barely visible. When she saw him, she pressed herself further into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. She held up a makeshift weapon, a jagged piece of metal that might once have been part of console. "Stay away." The translation matrix in Kale's helmet rendered her words in his language, though the voice came through as strained and weak. Kale immediately lowered his blaster and held up his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said again, making his movements slow and deliberate. "You're injured. I can help." The young Sylvan's eyes darted between his face and the exit, clearly calculating whether she could make it past him. Kale recognized the look of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust strangers. "Here," he said, reaching slowly into his bag. The Sylvan tensed, raising her makeshift weapon higher. Kale pulled out a water container and a nutrient bar, setting them on the ground between them. "You need these. Take them." Her gaze locked on the water, and Kale could see the desperate thirst warring with her fear. After a long moment, still keeping her eyes on him, she lunged forward and snatched the container, retreating to her corner. She sniffed it cautiously before taking a small sip. When nothing immediate happened, she began to drink more deeply. "What's your name?" Kale asked after she had taken the edge off her thirst. She hesitated, eyeing him warily over the rim of the container. "Lyra," she finally said, her voice slightly steadier now. "Lyra," he repeated. "How long have you been here, Lyra?" She shrugged, a surprisingly human gesture. "Many cycles. Since the crash." "Were you alone?" Kale asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. The wreck didn't show signs of multiple survivors. Lyra's feathery crown flattened further. "The others didn't survive the landing," she said softly. "I was in the maintenance shaft during the crash. It protected me." Kale nodded, not pressing for details. "Your injuries need treatment," he said instead, "and you can't stay here. The ship's structural integrity is failing. Another few weeks, and it might collapse completely." "I have nowhere else," Lyra said, a simple statement of fact without self-pity. Kale found himself at a crossroads. The sensible thing, the thing he would have done without hesitation a decade ago, will be to notify the nearest outpost about a Sylvan survivor and continue on his way. It wasn't his problem. He worked alone for a reason. Attachments were messy, dangerous things. But something in the determined set of this child's shoulders, in the resourcefulness that had kept her alive in this wreck, when most would have perished, and in those large, wary eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, resonated with him in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. "My ship isn't far," he found himself saying. "It's not much, but it's stable and has medical supplies. You can rest there, regain your strength. After that, we'll figure something out." Lyra stared at him intently, and Kale remembered that Sylvans were empathic. She was likely sensing his intentions, determining whether he could be trusted. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. A good question, one Kale wasn't entirely sure he had an answer for. "Because leaving an injured kid alone in a deteriorating wreck isn't something I could live with," he said simply. After what seemed like an eternity, Lyra gave a small nod. "If you try to harm me, I will defend myself," she said, raising her makeshift weapon slightly. Kale couldn't help but smile slightly at the brave front. "Understood. Can you walk?" She could, but barely. Her injury, combined with malnutrition and dehydration, had taken a severe toll. Kale ended up supporting most of her weight as they made their slow way out of the wreck. By the time they reached the rust bucket, Lyra was trembling with exhaustion. The ship's airlock closed behind them with a reassuring thud. Kale helped Lyra to the small medical bay, really just a repurposed storage room with basic equipment. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in every detail of her new surroundings. "It's not pretty," Kale said as he gathered supplies, "but it's secure. Rest here. I'll get you something more substantial to eat and treat that wound." As he turned to leave, Lyra's voice stopped him. "What will happen to me after?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Kale knew he should have an answer, a plan. But all he had was an impulsive decision and a sense that he couldn't have done otherwise. "Let's focus on getting you healthy first," he said. "The rest we'll figure out as we go." The door closed behind him, leaving Lyra alone in the small medical bay. Through the viewport, the vast junkyard of Xylos stretched to the horizon, a desolate landscape that had become her prison. But for the first time since the crash, there was something else too, a fragile, tentative possibility of safety. The first weeks were awkward, to say the least. Kale had lived alone for so long that having another presence on his ship felt like an invasion. Lyra, for her part, moved like a ghost, minimizing her presence, watching Kale with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Her wound healed quickly once properly treated. Sylvans apparently had remarkable regenerative abilities, but she remained weak and malnourished. Communication was stilted. While the translation matrix handled the basics, there were cultural nuances and expressions that didn't transmit well. Kale would say something he thought was perfectly clear, only to be met with Lyra's confused stare. Similarly, some of Lyra's phrases and references went completely over his head. Kale cleared out a small storage room adjacent to the engine room for her. It wasn't ideal, the constant hum of the engines made for noisy sleeping, but it was the only space he could spare. He gave her a cot, some basic supplies, and what few personal items he could find that might be suitable for a young Sylvan. "This is your space," he told her, showing her how to operate the privacy lock. "No one enters without your permission. Not even me." Lyra had looked at him with surprise. "I can close the door." "Of course," Kale said, puzzled by the question. "On the ship before, the doors were always open. For inspection." Kale felt a chill at the implication. "What kind of ship were you on?" "Exactly," he asked carefully. But Lyra had turned away, her feathery crown flattening in what Kale was beginning to recognize as a sign of distress. "A bad one," was all she said. Kale didn't push. Whatever her story was, and he had growing suspicions it wasn't pleasant, she would share it when and if she felt ready. Instead, he focused on establishing basic routines. He explained the ship's functions, set boundaries about which areas were off-limits without supervision, the main controls, the exterior airlock, his private quarters, and worked out a simple system for meal times and basic necessities. 3 weeks in, watching Lyra struggle to reach a high shelf in the galley, Kale realized that if she was going to stay aboard, and he was increasingly accepting that as the default plan, she needed to be able to function independently. Starting tomorrow, he announced over their sparse dinner of reconstituted protein and synthesized vegetables, "You're going to learn how this ship works." Lyra looked up from her food, surprise evident on her face. "Why?" "Because you live here now," Kale said simply, "and everyone on this ship needs to pull their weight." The next morning, Kale led Lyra to the engine room. He started with basics, how to read the diagnostic panels, what the different alert sounds meant, which indicators required immediate attention. Lyra watched with intense concentration, absorbing every word. When Kale handed her a basic spanner and showed her how to tighten loose connections, her hands were clumsy and uncertain. "Sorry," she muttered after dropping the tool for the third time. "It takes practice," Kale said, with more patience than he knew he possessed. "Try again." And she did, over and over, until by the end of the session, she could complete the simple task without fumbling. The tiny smile of accomplishment that fleetingly crossed her face was unexpectedly rewarding. The lessons continued, expanding from basic maintenance to navigation, communications, and essential survival skills. Kale began taking Lyra with him on simple salvage operations, teaching her to identify valuable components and avoid dangers. Her Sylvan abilities proved surprisingly useful. She could sense residual energy in systems Kale would have thought dead, leading them to overlooked treasures. Her smaller size and nimble fingers allowed her to reach components in tight spaces that Kale would have had to dismantle panels to access. "How do you do that?" Kale asked one day, watching as Lyra concentrated on a seemingly dead console, her feathery crown fully extended and gently waving. "All things speak," she said cryptically. "Machines have memories like people, echoes of what they were." "Must be handy," Kale commented, not fully understanding but recognizing the value of her gift. Lyra shrugged. "It is what it is," but there was a hint of pride in her voice that hadn't been there before. One evening, after a particularly successful salvage operation where Lyra had located a cache of rare minerals hidden in a section Kale would have overlooked, he decided a small celebration was in order. From his personal stores, rarely touched, he produced a tin of Real coffee, a luxury item in the outer rim. The rich aroma filled the galley as he brewed it, drawing Lyra from her room like a curious animal. "What does that smell?" she asked, inhaling deeply. "Coffee. Real coffee, not the synthesized stuff." Kale poured 2 cups. "Ever had it?" Lyra shook her head. Kale handed her a cup. "Careful, it's hot." She took a cautious sip, her eyes widening at the taste. For a moment, her natural bioluminescence brightened noticeably, and her crown extended fully, a sign of pleasure, Kale had learned. "It's intense," she said, taking another sip. "It's a special occasion," Kale said. "You did good work today." They sat in companionable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the stars through the galley viewport. Xylos's smaller moon was rising, casting an eerie purple glow over the landscape of metal and dust. "I've never seen anything like this," Lyra said suddenly, gesturing at the view. "Like what?" Kale asked. "A sunset. Stars. I was born on a transport ship, spent my whole life on vessels." She hesitated, then added quietly, not by choice. It was the first real hint she'd given about her past. Kale felt a familiar anger rising. He'd seen too much of the darker sides of the galaxy not to recognize what she was implying. "Slavers?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Lyra nodded almost imperceptibly. "My people. We're valued for our abilities. It took me when I was very small. I don't remember much about home." Kale's hand tightened around his cup. "The ship that crashed was taking me to a new owner," Lyra finished. "The others were crew. Guards." A small, dark smile flitted across her face. "I didn't try to help them after the crash." Kale nodded, understanding. "Can't say I blame you." They lapsed into silence again, but it was different now, a silence built on shared understanding rather than awkward caution. The next morning, Kale found that the faulty temperature regulator in his quarters, which had been giving him trouble for months, had been repaired overnight. Lyra said nothing about it, but the small smile she wore when he mentioned it spoke volumes. Their first real challenge came 3 months after Lyra's arrival. Kale had taken the rust bucket to one of the larger debris fields, where the remnants of an old battle offered potentially valuable military-grade components. Such sites came with added risks, unexploded ordnance, active defense systems, and the attention of other, less scrupulous salvagers. They were deep in the hold of a destroyed frigate when Kale's proximity alert buzzed. He checked the readout and cursed softly. "What is it?" Lyra asked. Looking up from the panel, she was carefully dismantling. "Company," Kale said grimly, "and not the friendly kind. Pack up, quickly." They worked with practiced efficiency to secure their finds, but just as they were preparing to return to their ship, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor. Kale motioned for Lyra to stay behind him, drawing his blaster. 3 figures appeared at the far end of the hallway, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting. Their mismatched armor and casual posture marked them as scavengers rather than any official presence. Well, the leader called out, a stocky man with a cybernetic eye that glowed faintly red in the gloom. Looks like we're not the first to find this treasure trove. Kale, isn't it? Heard you've been working this sector. Kale kept his blaster steady. Plenty to go around, Drex. No need for trouble. Drex's gaze shifted to Lyra, partially hidden behind Kale. His cybernetic eye whirred as it focused. Is that a Sylvan? The interest in his voice was immediate and predatory. Those are worth a fortune in certain markets. Didn't know you were into trafficking, Kale. She's my crew, Kale said, his voice hardening. Not for sale, not for discussion. Drex laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Come now, surely we can discuss a price. Girl like that, wasted on a salvage operation. Kale felt Lyra tense behind him. There's no discussion to be had, he said flatly. We're leaving. You've got the whole wreck to yourselves. The other scavengers had spread out slightly, flanking their leader. One had his hand resting none too subtly on his own weapon. I don't think so, Drex said, his cybernetic eye narrowing. Some find are too good to pass up. What happened next occurred so quickly that Kale barely had time to react. Just as the tension peaked, the lights in the corridor suddenly flared to blinding intensity, followed immediately by complete darkness. In the confusion, Kale felt Lyra's hand grip his arm, pulling him to the left. This way, she whispered. Maintenance tunnel. I can feel it. Trusting her, Kale allowed himself to be guided. Behind them, he could hear cursing and the sound of the scavengers stumbling around in the dark. Lyra's hand found a panel that Kale would never have noticed, and suddenly they were crawling through a tight service passage. How did you do that with the lights? Kale panted as they emerged into a different section of the ship. Told the system there was a fire, Lyra explained, her bioluminescence providing just enough light to see by. Emergency protocols took over. They made it back to the rust bucket and disengaged from the wreck before Drex and his crew could catch up. As they accelerated away, Kale glanced at Lyra. She was trembling slightly, but looked determined rather than frightened. That was quick thinking back there, he said. Lyra shrugged. We're a team, right? That's what you said. Kale felt something shift in his perception then. When he'd first brought her aboard, she had been a responsibility, a burden he'd taken on out of reluctant conscience. Somewhere along the way, without him noticing, she had indeed become part of his crew, his team. Right, he agreed. That's exactly what we are. 3 years passed with surprising speed. The rust bucket continued its lonely journeys through the scrapyards and debris fields of the outer rim, but its interior had gradually changed. The stark, utilitarian spaces had become more than just functional. They had become a home. Lyra's quarters now reflected her personality. Adorned with strange crystalline formations she collected from certain types of wreckage, plants grown from seeds salvaged from an abandoned agricultural vessel, and technical projects in various states of completion. She had a gift for coaxing life and function from things others had discarded as dead or useless. Lyra herself had changed even more dramatically. No longer the frightened, malnourished child Kale had found in the wreckage. She had grown into her Sylvan heritage. Now in her late teens by human equivalent standards, she had the lithe, graceful physique characteristic of her species. Her bioluminescence, once dim and faltering, now glowed with healthy intensity, shifting colors subtly with her moods, a trait Kale had learned to read as clearly as facial expressions. She had become not just capable, but essential to their operation. Her technical skills, honed by years of practice and complemented by her natural Sylvan abilities, allowed them to undertake salvage operations that would have been impossible for Kale alone. Her intuitive understanding of systems, her ability to navigate the most complex wrecks, and her knack for finding valuable components had doubled their income. Their relationship had evolved into a comfortable partnership. Kale had assumed a mentor role, teaching Lyra everything he knew about survival in the harsh realities of the Outer Rim. She, in turn, had brought a perspective and skill set that complemented his own. Their interactions had developed a relaxed familiarity, complete with inside jokes and shorthand communications that would have been incomprehensible to outsiders. For Kale, who had spent so many years in solitude, the presence of another person on his ship had ceased to feel like an intrusion and had become, unexpectedly, something he valued. He found himself taking fewer risks, making more careful decisions, behaviors he recognized, with some surprise, as protective instincts he thought he'd lost years ago. And yet, as Lyra matured, subtle tensions began to emerge, shifts in dynamics neither of them acknowledged openly. It started with small moments, a lingering glance when Lyra thought Kale wasn't watching, Kale finding reasons to keep physical distance between them, conversations that suddenly veered into awkward territory and were hastily redirected. One of the first noticeable instances came after a particularly risky salvage operation on an abandoned research station. A section of flooring had given way beneath Kale, nearly sending him plummeting into an exposed reactor shaft. Lyra had reacted with lightning reflexes, using a salvaged grappling line to catch a midfall. As she helped pull him to safety, they found themselves face to face, closer than they had been in months. For a heartbeat too long, neither moved. Away, Kale became acutely aware of how different she looked now. Not the child he had rescued, but a young woman with an intensity in her gaze that made him unexpectedly self-conscious. "Good save," he said gruffly, stepping back and brushing dust from his clothes with more attention than necessary. "You should be more careful," Lyra replied, her crown feathers shifting in a pattern Kale hadn't seen before. Not fear or distress, but something else entirely. The incident passed without comment, but similar moments began to accumulate. Kale found himself increasingly conscious of Lyra's presence in ways that confused and unsettled him. He began to spend more time in his private quarters or volunteering for solo tasks that would give him space to clear his head. Lyra, too, seemed to be struggling with changes she didn't fully understand. Her empathic abilities made her particularly sensitive to emotional undercurrents, and Kale's growing discomfort did not go unnoticed. She began to withdraw in her own way, becoming uncharacteristically formal in some of their interactions. The tension came to a head during a rare shore leave at Meridian Station, one of the more developed outposts in the sector. They had just completed a lucrative job delivering rare components to a private collector, and Kale had suggested they take a few days to resupply and rest before their next venture. Meridian's bustling marketplace was a sensory overload after months in the relative isolation of the Rust Bucket. Vibrant stalls selling goods from across the galaxy, the babble of dozens of languages, and the aromas of exotic foods created an atmosphere of chaotic energy. Lyra, despite having visited similar outposts before, still marveled at the diversity and vitality of such places. Her natural bioluminescence, which she typically subdued in public to avoid unwanted attention, occasionally flared with excitement as they navigated the crowded thoroughfares. They were selecting supplies at a well-stocked vendor when a voice called out, "Kale? By the stars, it is you." They turned to see a woman approaching, human, perhaps in her late 30s, with the confident bearing of someone used to command. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and a thin scar ran along her jawline, but her smile was warm and genuine. "Sarah," Kale said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you in this sector." "Transferred to Border Patrol last year," the woman replied, clasping Kale's forearm in a familiar greeting. "Keeping the peace, as much as that's possible out here." Her gaze shifted to Lyra, curiosity evident. "And who might this be?" "This is Lyra," Kale said. "My associate. We work salvage together." Lyra nodded politely, but Kale didn't miss the slight flattening of her crowned feathers at his hesitation. "A Sylvan, working salvage?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's an unusual career choice for one with your gifts." "It suits me," Lyra replied simply. Sarah's gaze moved between the two of them with professional assessment. How long have you two been working together? About 3 years now, Cale answered. 3 years, and associate is the best term you've come up with? Sarah laughed. Still the same emotionally constipated Cale. She turned to Lyra. I serve with him in the coalition forces, you know. Best pilot in the squadron. Terrible at expressing anything resembling a feeling. Cale shifted uncomfortably. So, relax. I'm not going to tell all your war stories. Sarah's expression softened slightly. It's good to see you, Cale. You look better than the last time. Less haunted. An awkward silence followed, broken by Sarah checking her comm unit. Duty calls, I'm afraid. But I'm stationed here for another 3 months. We should catch up properly before you leave. She handed Cale a contact chip. My quarters. Tonight, if you're free. Bring your associate if you'd like. The slight emphasis on the word was unmistakable. After she departed, Cale and Lyra resumed their shopping in uncomfortable silence. It wasn't until they were heading back to the rust bucket, laden with supplies, that Lyra spoke. You should go, she said. Catch up with your friend. We have resupplying to finish, Cale replied, not meeting her gaze. I can handle that. Lyra's voice was carefully neutral. You deserve some time with an old friend. Something in her tone made Cale look at her sharply. Her bioluminescence was dimmed, and her crown feathers lay flat against her skull, signs he'd come to recognize as indicating displeasure or distress. What's wrong? He asked directly. Nothing, Lyra replied too quickly. Then, with a sigh, she seemed nice. Attractive. For a human. Cale stared at her, momentarily confused by the non sequitur. So, we served together. She is a friend? Just a friend? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Cale felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Why does that matter? Lyra looked away. It doesn't. I realized I know very little about your life before. Who you were. Who was important to you. The conversation was veering into territory Cale had studiously avoided. His past, the war, the losses, the reasons he'd chosen isolation, was a closed book. He'd never discussed it with Lyra, and she, understanding his boundaries, had rarely asked. Ancient history, he said dismissively. Not worth discussing. I've told you everything about me, Lyra said quietly. My past. My fears. Everything. That's different. Ow! There was a challenge in her voice now. You were a kid who needed to process trauma. Cale struggled for words. A grown man who doesn't need to share. Lyra finished for him. Or maybe just doesn't need to share with me? The accusation stung more than it should have. That's not fair. What's not fair is being treated like a child 1 minute and expected to be a fully capable partner the next, Lyra retorted, her bioluminescence flaring with emotion. I'm not the scared girl you found in that wreck anymore, Cale. I know that, Cale said, frustration building. Believe me, I know. Something in his tone made Lyra pause. She studied his face, her empathic senses clearly picking up more than just his words. What does that mean? She asked, her voice softer now. Cale ran a hand through his graying hair. Nothing. It means nothing. Look, I'm going to check on the ship. You finished the supply run. He turned and walked away before she could respond, leaving Lyra standing in the busy thoroughfare, watching his retreating back with a mixture of confusion and hurt. That night, Cale did go to see Sarah, partly to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere on the rust bucket. Their conversation was pleasant enough, reminiscing about old times and catching up on the intervening years. But when Sarah inevitably broached the subject of Lyra, Cale became evasive. She's special to you, Sarah observed after Cale's third attempt to change the subject. She's a good partner. Talented. Reliable, Cale replied stiffly. Sarah studied him over the rim of her glass. That's not what I meant, and you know it. She was a kid when I found her. Injured, traumatized. I took her in, taught her. That's all. Was, Sarah noted. Past tense. She's not a kid now, Cale. And the way you tense up every time I mention her tells me more than you realize. Cale drained his glass. You're reading too much into it. Maybe. Sarah refilled his glass. Or maybe you're not reading enough into it. Either way, I recognize that look. You're running from something. Again, I'm not running from anything, Kale protested. We have a good arrangement. It works. Until it doesn't, Sarah said softly. Until one of you can't keep pretending anymore. Kale had no answer for that. When he returned to the rust bucket, Lyra was nowhere to be seen, likely in her quarters. Kale retreated to his own room, Sarah's words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. The next morning, they departed Meridian Station in strained silence. The tension continued as they resumed their salvage operations, a new awkwardness underlying their usually seamless teamwork. For weeks, their interaction remained professional but distant. Kale found himself increasingly distracted, overthinking every word and gesture. He caught himself watching Lyra when she was absorbed in a task, noticing things he'd been subconsciously avoiding. The graceful efficiency of her movements, the way her bioluminescence brightened when she solved a particularly challenging problem, the subtle maturity that had transformed her from the frightened child he'd rescued into a capable, intelligent young woman. Each time he caught himself, he would deliberately redirect his attention, angry at his own lack of discipline. She trusted him. He had been her guardian, her teacher. These complications were his problem to deal with, not hers. Lyra, too, seemed caught in her own internal struggle. Her empathic nature made complete emotional concealment impossible. Kale could see the conflict in the unpredictable patterns of her bioluminescence, in the way her crown feathers would sometimes extend fully when he entered a room and then flatten immediately as she exerted control. They were trapped in an unspoken stalemate, both aware something had changed, but neither willing to acknowledge it directly. The breaking point came during a salvage operation on an abandoned military outpost. Intelligence from their buyers suggested the outpost contained valuable prototype technology, but also warned of still-active defense systems. It was riskier than their usual jobs, but the potential payout was substantial enough to justify the danger. The outpost orbited a small, uninhabitable moon in a forgotten corner of the Vega sector. As they approached, the rust bucket's sensors confirmed what their intelligence had suggested: minimal power readings, but definite signs of active defense systems. We'll need to be careful, Kale said, studying the scan results. Automated turrets on the outer hull, and likely internal security measures as well. Lyra nodded. All business despite the tension that had characterized their recent interactions. I can feel them, she said, her crown feathers extending slightly as she reached out with her sylvan senses. The defense grid is semi-dormant, but will activate if we trigger certain parameters. Can you tell what those parameters are? Kale asked. Lyra closed her eyes, concentrating. Not specifically, but the system feels selective, like it's programmed to recognize certain signatures as friendly. Kale considered this. Military vessels would have had identification codes. If we could mimic one. We don't have that kind of technology, Lyra pointed out. No, Kale agreed, but we might be able to approach via blind spot. Defense systems like these are designed to protect against direct attacks, not stealth infiltrations. They spent hours analyzing the outpost structure and the placement of its defense systems, looking for vulnerabilities. Finally, they identified a maintenance airlock on the station's underside that appeared to have minimal coverage from the automated turrets. It's still risky, Kale said. We'll need to approach with minimal power, using the moon's gravity to mask our trajectory. I've done the calculations, Lyra replied, displaying a series of trajectories on the view screen. If we time it exactly right, we should have a 3-minute window where we're in the sensor's blind spot. The maneuver required precise timing and exceptional piloting. Kale took manual control, something he rarely did anymore since Lyra had proven herself more than capable at the helm. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, taking the co-pilot's seat instead. As they initiated the approach, the familiar rhythm of working together temporarily overrode the recent tension. Kale concentrated on the delicate trajectory, while Lyra monitored the outpost systems, alert for any sign they'd been detected. 30 seconds to blind spot window, she reported, her voice steady. Kale made a minute adjustment to their course. The rust bucket responded sluggishly at such low power, requiring anticipation and finesse rather than quick reactions. 20 seconds. 15. The outpost loomed larger in their view screen, its angular military design a stark contrast to the natural curve of the moon behind it. The automated turrets were visible now, dormant, but undoubtedly ready to activate at a moment's notice. 10 seconds. 5. We're entering the blind spot now. Kale increased power slightly, enough to maneuver more precisely without generating a significant energy signature. They glided toward the maintenance airlock, using the moon's gravity to maintain their approach vector. 2 minutes remaining in the window, Lyra reported, her bioluminescence dimmed to avoid any additional light signatures. The airlock grew larger in the view screen as they approached. Kale fired the maneuvering thrusters in short, controlled bursts, aligning the rust bucket's own airlock with the outpost's. 1 minute, Lyra said, tension evident in her voice. A warning light flashed on Kale's console. Drift in our lateral alignment, he muttered, making another adjustment. The rust bucket shuddered slightly as the thrusters fired against their momentum. 30 seconds. The airlocks were almost aligned, but not quite. Kale made one final adjustment, and then everything went wrong. Whether it was a miscalculation in their trajectory, an unexpected sensitivity in the outpost sensors, or simple bad luck, they never knew. What they did know was the sudden wail of alarms as the dormant defense system awakened. We've been detected. Lyra's fingers flew over her console. Turrets activating. Abandoning docking, Kale announced, already powering up the main engines. Evasive maneuvers. The first shots from the automated turrets flashed past the viewport as the rust bucket pulled away from the airlock. Kale pushed the engines hard, plotting a course that would put the bulk of the outpost between them and the majority of the turrets. Multiple targeting systems locked on us, Lyra reported grimly. They're predicting our course. A violent impact rocked the ship. Warning lights flashed across Kale's console as systems reported damage. Direct hit on the port stabilizer, Lyra called out. Structural integrity at 87%. Kale swore under his breath, adjusting their course to compensate for the damaged stabilizer. The rust bucket responded sluggishly, the smooth maneuverability of moments ago replaced by an alarming tendency to list to port. Another impact, less severe than the first but concerning nonetheless. Glancing hit to the rear shield generator, Lyra reported. Shields failing. Reroute power from non-essential systems, Kale ordered, wrestling with the increasingly unresponsive controls. Lyra's hands moved quickly over her console, executing the command with practiced efficiency. Done, but it won't hold for long. They were almost clear of the outpost's immediate range, but the damaged stabilizer made maintaining their escape trajectory increasingly difficult. The ship shuddered ominously as Kale pushed the engines beyond their recommended limits. Engine temperature critical, Lyra warned. We can't maintain this output. Just a little longer, Kale muttered, focused on the navigational display. If they could just reach the moon's shadow, they might have a chance to make emergency repairs before. The console exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. The impact threw Kale backward, his head striking the bulkhead behind him with stunning force. Through blurred vision, he saw flames erupting from the damaged console, the acrid smell of burning circuitry filling the bridge. Kale! Lyra's voice seemed to come from very far away. He tried to respond, but his body felt strangely disconnected, refusing to obey simple commands. He was vaguely aware of Lyra moving, grabbing the emergency extinguisher, fighting the flames that threatened to spread to other systems. The ship lurched violently, throwing her against the wall, but she recovered quickly, returning to the task with determined focus. With the immediate fire danger contained, she turned her attention to Kale. Her face appeared in his narrowing field of vision, her bioluminescence pulsing with alarm. Kale, stay with me, she urged, her voice cutting through the fog that seemed to be enveloping his thoughts. We need to get to the emergency medical bay. He tried to nod, but the movement sent waves of pain through his skull. Lyra's face tightened with concern. Without hesitation, She positioned herself under his arm, supporting his weight as she helped him to his feet. The journey to the medical bay was a blur of pain and disoriented stumbling. Cale was only partially conscious, relying on Lyra's strength and guidance. He had fleeting impressions of alarms still blaring, of the ship's internal lighting flickering ominously, of Lyra's voice, sometimes speaking to him, sometimes issuing command to the ship's semi-autonomous systems. The cool surface of the medical bay's treatment table was the next thing he registered clearly. Lyra was moving with urgent efficiency, activating the medical scanner, administering emergency treatments based on its readings. Concussion, she reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. And some internal bleeding. The autodoc can handle it. But we need to stabilize the ship or we won't last long enough for the treatment to matter. Cale tried to sit up, knowing she was right. The ship needed attention immediately. But his body betrayed him, weakness and dizziness forcing him back down. Stay still, Lyra ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. I'll handle the ship. You can't. Cale began, his words slurring slightly. Too damaged. Need manual. I can and I will, Lyra cut him off. I didn't spend 3 years learning from the best pilot in the Outer Rim to fall apart in an emergency. Her expression softened slightly. Trust me, Cale. Like I've trusted you. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him in the care of the autodoc's mechanical ministrations. Through the fog of pain and medication, Cale felt a surge of fear unlike anything he'd experienced in years. Not for himself, but for Lyra. The rust bucket was gravely damaged, possibly beyond saving. If anyone could pull off a miracle, it would be Lyra with her unique abilities, but the odds were overwhelmingly against her. And in that moment of fear, as the autodoc administered sedatives that pulled him toward unconsciousness, Cale confronted a truth he'd been avoiding for too long. The thought of losing Lyra was unbearable not because she was his responsibility or his student or even his friend, but because somewhere along the way, without his permission or awareness, she had become essential to him in a way no one had been for decades. The realization followed him down into darkness as the sedatives took full effect. Cale drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he surfaced, he caught fragments of the situation, the persistent wail of alarms, the shuddering of the hull, the occasional curse in Lyra's voice as she fought to keep the rust bucket intact. The autodoc continued its work, mending the internal damage caused by the impact, but Cale's mind remained foggy from the combination of concussion and medication. During one period of semi-awareness, he registered a significant change. The ship's movement had stabilized, the constant shuddering reduced to occasional tremors. The alarms, too, seemed fewer and less urgent. Through the haze, he felt a surge of pride. Lyra was doing it. Somehow, against the odds, she was saving them both. His next moment of clarity came with the gentle touch of a cool cloth on his forehead. Cale opened his eyes to find Lyra beside him, her bioluminescence dimmed with exhaustion, but her eyes alert and watching him intently. "Welcome back," she said softly. "How do you feel?" Cale took inventory of his body. The pain had receded to a dull throb, and the disorientation was less severe. "Like I lost an argument with a cargo loader," he replied, his voice rough. "But functional. The ship, stabilized," Lyra said, setting aside the cloth. "We're adrift, but in a stable orbit around the moon. Life support is operational, and I've managed to contain the worst of the damage. We won't be winning any races, but we'll survive." Cale attempted to sit up, moving more cautiously this time. Lyra supported him, her touch steady and sure. "How long was I out?" he asked. "About 14 hours, Lyra answered. "The autodoc says your concussion was severe. You shouldn't be moving around yet." 14 hours. 14 hours during which Lyra had single-handedly kept them alive. "You did all this alone?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I had a good teacher." The simple statement, delivered without drama or expectation, struck Cale with unexpected force. In the years they'd spent together, how often had he acknowledged her growth, her contributions? How often had he treated her as a true equal rather than someone under his protection? "I need to see the damage," he said, avoiding the emotional territory those thoughts were leading toward. Lyra looked as though she wanted to argue, but instead nodded. All right, but slowly, with her assistance, Cale made his way to the bridge. The evidence of their narrow escape was everywhere. Burned-out consoles, emergency patches on damaged systems, the acrid smell of electrical fires still lingering in the air, despite the environmental scrubbers working overtime. The main view screen showed their position relative to the moon and the military outpost. They were indeed in a stable orbit, far enough from the outpost to be outside its defense system's range, but still trapped by the moon's gravity. The main engines are offline, Lyra explained as Cale examined the damage reports. I had to shut them down to prevent a cascade failure. The auxiliary power is handling life support and critical systems, but that's about it. Communications? Limited to short range. I've been broadcasting a distress signal, but in this sector, she didn't need to finish the thought. This far from established trade routes, the chances of someone friendly responding to their distress call were slim at best. What about the emergency beacon? Cale asked. Lyra's expression tightened. It was damaged in the initial attack. I tried to repair it, but... So we're stranded, Cale concluded. For now, Lyra agreed. But I have some ideas for repairs. If we can get even partial function back in the main engines, we might be able to break orbit and limp to the nearest outpost. Cale nodded, but the movement sent a wave of dizziness through him. Lyra noticed immediately, her hand steadying his arm. That's enough for now. You need to rest, she said firmly. The repairs can wait until you're stronger. This time, Cale didn't argue. The brief excursion had exhausted him more than he cared to admit. As Lyra helped him back to the medical bay, he found himself leaning on her more heavily than he'd intended. Once he was settled back on the treatment table, Lyra checked the autodoc's readings. You should sleep, she said. Natural sleep this time, if you can. The autodoc has done most of its work. Cale caught her wrist as she turned to leave. You need rest too, he said, noting the signs of exhaustion in her dimmed bioluminescence and the slight droop of her crown feathers. I will, she promised. I just want to check a few systems first. Something in her tone suggested she wasn't being entirely forthcoming. Lyra, Cale said, maintaining his gentle hold on her wrist, what aren't you telling me? She hesitated, then sighed. The life support system is stable for now, but there was more damage than I initially reported. We have maybe 3 days before the auxiliary power cells deplete, if we haven't repaired the main engines by then. The implication was clear. 3 days before they lost power, heat, and eventually oxygen. 3 days to perform repairs that would normally take a fully equipped maintenance crew at least a week. Why didn't you tell me this immediately? Cale asked, trying to keep accusation from his voice. Because you need to heal, Lyra replied simply. And because I'm handling it. The confidence in her voice, not bravado, but genuine assurance, gave Cale pause. This wasn't the frightened girl he'd rescued, nor even the capable apprentice she'd become. This was a partner taking charge in a crisis, making decisions, and accepting responsibility. What's your plan, he asked finally. I've identified the critical components needed to restore minimal function to the engines, Lyra explained. Most are beyond repair, but we might be able to cannibalize non-essential systems to create substitutes. That's extremely technical work, Cale said cautiously. Even for you. A hint of a smile touched Lyra's lips. I'm not just technically skilled, Cale. I'm Sylvan. Our connection to technology goes deeper than manual repairs. Her crown feathers extended slightly, emphasizing her point. I can guide the systems, convince them to accept improvised components. It won't be elegant, but it might be enough to get us moving again. Cale had seen glimpses of this aspect of her abilities over the years, moments when she seemed to communicate with machinery in ways that defied conventional understanding. But what she was suggesting went far beyond anything she'd attempted before. It's dangerous, he said, concern evident in his voice. Using your abilities at that level could drain you completely. I'm aware of the risks, Lyra replied, her gaze steady. But it's our best chance. Cale wanted to argue, to forbid her from taking such a risk, to insist they find another way. But the rational part of him knew she was right. Without main engine function, they were as good as dead already. We do it together, he said instead. Once I've rested. 2 minds are better than 1, especially when attempting the impossible. Relief flickered across Lyra's features. She had clearly expected more resistance. Agreed. Get some sleep, Kale. I'll wake you in 6 hours, and we can start then. As she turned to leave, Kale called after her softly. Lyra. She paused, looking back. Thank you for saving us. For everything. Her bioluminescence brightened briefly, a wash of color that reflected emotion too complex for words. Then she was gone, leaving Kale to rest and prepare for the challenge ahead. True to her word, Lyra woke him 6 hours later. The autodoc confirmed what Kale already felt. He was healing, though far from fully recovered. Still, time was a luxury they no longer possessed. With Lyra's help, he made his way to the engine room, where she had already begun preparations for their desperate repair attempt. The damage was even more extensive than Kale had feared. The main power coupling had been completely destroyed in the attack, and several critical regulatory systems were beyond conventional repair. Components that would have been routinely available at any maintenance dock were priceless here, adrift in empty space. I've salvaged what I could from non-essential systems, Lyra explained, showing him the collection of parts she'd gathered. And I've designed some makeshift replacements for the components we can't recover. Her workspace was meticulously organized, the improvised repairs laid out in logical sequence. Kale examined her work with growing appreciation. The solutions were unorthodox, but showed deep understanding of the principles involved. This might actually work, he admitted. It has to, Lyra replied simply. They set to work, falling into the familiar rhythm of collaboration that had characterized their best moments together. Kale's experience complemented Lyra's intuition, his practical knowledge balancing her innovative approaches. Despite his still-healing injuries, Kale found the focused work oddly invigorating, the urgent challenge driving away the lingering awkwardness that had plagued them since Meridian Station. Hours passed as they gradually rebuilt the damaged systems. When conventional repairs reached their limit, Lyra began to employ her Sylvan abilities more directly. Kale watched with fascination as she placed her hands on damaged components, her crown feathers fully extended, her bioluminescence pulsing in complex patterns as she communicated with the ship's systems on a level he could never access. The strain was evident in her face. The process clearly demanded tremendous concentration and energy, but the results were undeniable. Systems that should have rejected the improvised repairs began to function, adapting to the makeshift components as if they were purpose-built replacements. How are you doing this? Kale asked during a brief rest period, handing Lyra a hydration pack. She accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before answering. It's difficult to explain to someone who isn't Sylvan, she said finally. We don't just interact with technology, we form relationships with it. I'm essentially asking the systems to trust these new components, to accept them as part of the whole. And they listen to you? A tired smile crossed her face. Not always willingly. It's more like a negotiation. I have to convince them it's in their best interest to adapt. She glanced at the partially repaired engine core. This ship has been through a lot with us. There's a memory of sorts in the systems. That helps. The idea that the rust bucket might have some form of awareness, however rudimentary, was simultaneously unsettling and oddly comforting to Kale. How many times had this ship brought them safely through dangerous situations? How many years had it been their home, their protection against the void? We're asking a lot of her, he said quietly, surprising himself with the personification. She understands, Lyra replied with complete seriousness. Ships like this, they develop a kind of, not consciousness exactly, but a pattern, an echo of all the decisions and actions that have shaped them. She placed a hand gently on the nearest bulkhead. She knows we're trying to save her too. The moment held a strange intimacy, as if they were discussing a mutual friend rather than an inanimate vessel. It struck Kale that this was a side of Lyra he had never fully appreciated, her Sylvan perspective on the world, so fundamentally different from his own human understanding, yet containing its own complex wisdom. They returned to work with renewed determination. The hours blurred together as they raced against the steadily depleting auxiliary power. Twice, Kale had to insist Lyra take breaks when her bioluminescence dimmed to concerning levels, a sign of dangerous energy depletion among Sylvans. Each time, she protested but ultimately acquiesced, knowing her complete collapse would doom them both. By what would have been the end of the second day, if such distinctions held meaning in their current situation, they had accomplished what Kale would have previously considered impossible. The main engine was ready for a test activation, running on improvised components and Sylvan-enhanced connections that defied conventional engineering principles. Power levels at 28%, Kale reported from the auxiliary control panel they had rigged in the engine room. Not ideal, but it might be enough. Lyra nodded, her exhaustion evident but determination undiminished. The structural integrity field is holding at acceptable levels. If we keep our speed conservative, we should make it to the Pelion outpost. Ready for startup sequence? As ready as we'll ever be. Kale began the careful process of bringing the main engine online. Each step was tense, every indicator closely monitored for signs of rejection or failure. The ship hummed around them, vibrations increasing as power flowed through the repaired systems. Warning lights flashed, then steadied. Temperature gauges rose, then stabilized just within acceptable parameters. The distinctive sound of the main engine, a low, resonant thrum that Kale hadn't realized how much he'd missed, filled the engine room. "It's working," Lyra said, disbelief and triumph mingling in her voice. "It's actually working." Kale allowed himself a moment of relief before focusing on the next challenge. "Now we need to break orbit and set course for Pelion. Can you monitor the engine readings from here while I handle navigation?" Lyra nodded, already moving to the control panel. "Go. I've got this." Kale made his way to the bridge, moving more steadily now as his body continued to heal. The familiar space, despite its battle damage, welcomed him like an old friend. He settled into the pilot's seat, running his hands over the controls with something approaching reverence. "All right, old girl," he murmured to the ship. "Let's see what you can do." The navigation systems responded sluggishly but functionally as he plotted their course to Pelion Outpost. It would be a journey of approximately 40 hours at their reduced speed, well within the capabilities of their jury-rig repairs, assuming nothing else went wrong. Course plotted, he announced over the internal comm. "Engine status?" "Holding steady," Lyra's voice replied. "Ready when you are." With careful precision, Kale engaged the maneuvering thrusters, gradually breaking them free from the moon's gravitational influence. The rust bucket shuddered slightly, but remained intact as they slowly accelerated away from the site of their near destruction. Once they were clear of the immediate gravitational well, Kale engaged the main engine at minimal power. The ship lurched momentarily, then settled into a steady trajectory toward Pelion. "We're clear," he reported. "Main engine functioning at 23% capacity. Estimated arrival at Pelion in 42 hours. "I'll continue monitoring from here," Lyra replied, fatigue evident in her voice despite her attempt to hide it. "Negative," Kale said firmly. "You need rest. The automated systems can handle monitoring for now. If there's any variation beyond acceptable parameters, the alarms will alert us." There was a brief pause before Lyra responded. "Acknowledged. I'll be in my quarters." The comm clicked off. Kale frowned, concerned by the hesitation in her voice. After setting the navigation to autopilot, he made his way back through the ship to check on her. He found Lyra not in her quarters, but slumped against the wall in the corridor outside the engine room, her bioluminescence dangerously dim, her breathing shallow and rapid. She had clearly collapsed on her way to her room. "Lyra!" Kale rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. Her skin was cool to the touch, a sign of severe energy depletion in Sylvan's. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with effort. "Sorry," she murmured. "Just needed a moment." Without hesitation, Kale gathered her into his arms, lifting her with as much care as he could. The action sent a twinge of pain through his still healing body, but he ignored it, focused entirely on getting Lyra to her quarters. She was lighter than he expected, or perhaps adrenaline was lending him strength. Either way, he managed to carry her to her room and gently lay her on her bunk. The space reflected her personality so completely, part workshop, part botanical garden, part private sanctuary, that for a moment, Cale felt like an intruder. "You pushed yourself too far," he said, unable to keep the concern from his voice as he pulled a thermal blanket over her. "Had to," Lyra replied weakly, "or we'd both be dead." Cale couldn't argue with that. Instead, he reached for the emergency medical kit he knew she kept in her quarters, retrieving the Sylvan-specific supplements she occasionally used after particularly strenuous use of her abilities. "Here," he said, preparing the supplement according to the instructions. "This should help." Lyra accepted it with a grateful nod, consuming the nutrient-rich gel with a grimace at its apparently unpleasant taste. For a few minutes, they sat in silence as the supplement began to take effect, Lyra's bioluminescence gradually strengthening from alarming dimness to a more stable, if subdued, glow. "Better?" Cale asked when her breathing had normalized. "Getting there," she confirmed. "I just need to rest." She attempted to sit up, but Cale gently pushed her back down. "You've done enough," he said. "More than enough. It's my turn to keep watch." Lyra looked as though she wanted to protest, but lacked the energy. Instead, she asked, "The ship?" "Stable. We're on course for Pelion. Your repairs are holding." Cale hesitated, then added quietly, "You saved us, Lyra. Both me and the ship." Her crown feathers shifted slightly, a gesture he'd come to recognize as embarrassment or modesty. "We saved us," she corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." "Yes, you could have," Cale said with certainty. "Maybe not today, but soon. You've surpassed everything I could teach you." The admission cost him something, a letting go of the mentorship role that had defined their relationship for so long, but it also felt right, a truth that needed acknowledgement. Lyra studied his face, her empathic senses undoubtedly picking up more than just his words. "Why does that make you sad?" she asked softly. The directness of the question caught Cale off guard. His first instinct was to deny it, to deflect as he had so many times before. But surrounded by the evidence of their narrow escape, the fragility of life made such evasions seem suddenly pointless. "Because it changes things," he admitted. "It means you don't need me anymore. Not like before. Is that what you think?" Lyra's voice strengthened with emotion. "That I only stayed because I needed a teacher? Isn't it?" The question emerged more vulnerable than Cale had intended. Lyra pushed herself up despite his earlier admonition, meeting his gaze directly. "Cale, I could have left years ago if all I wanted was independence. I stay because..." She faltered, her bioluminescence shifting through colors that reflected complex emotions. "Because the rust bucket became home. Because we became..." "What?" Cale prompted when she didn't continue. "What did we become, Lyra?" The moment hung between them, fragile and charged with possibility. In Lyra's eyes, Cale could see the same conflict he'd been battling himself. The weight of their history against the pull of changing feelings, the fear of rejection against the need for honesty. "Something I don't have a word for," she finally said. "In any language I know, something that started as one thing and became more." Her crown feathers extended fully, a sylvan gesture of complete emotional openness. It was the most vulnerable he'd ever seen her, deliberately lowering all defenses. "I know I'm not human," she continued, words coming faster now. "I know there's the age difference, our history, all the reasons why you've been pulling away. But I need you to know that I stayed because I wanted to, because I care about you. Not as a student or a child you rescued, but as me, as Lyra." The raw honesty of her declaration left Cale speechless. All the careful walls he'd built, all the reasons he'd repeated to himself for maintaining distance, they seemed flimsy in the face of her courage. "You nearly died trying to save me," she continued into his silence, her voice quieter now. "And earlier, when you thought we might not make it, I felt something from you. Something you've been hiding. Was I wrong?" Cale found himself at a crossroads more significant than any he'd faced in years. The safe path lay in denial, in preserving the status quo despite its increasing strain. The other path, the honest one, was terrifying in its uncertainty. No, he said finally, the word emerging rough with emotion. You weren't wrong. Lyra's bioluminescence brightened momentarily with hope. Then why have you been pulling away? Why can't you talk to me? Because it's complicated, Lyra. Kale ran a hand through his hair in frustration. When I found you, you were a child who needed protection. I took responsibility for you. To feel what I've been feeling, it seemed like a betrayal of that. I haven't been that child for a long time, Lyra said gently. I know. Kale's voice softened. Believe me, I know. But old habits, old ways of thinking, they're hard to break. So break them, Lyra challenged, her strength returning with the intensity of the conversation. We almost died today, Kale. We might still die before we reach Pelion. Are you really going to let those old habits rob us of whatever time we have? The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer. Kale looked at Lyra, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened child he'd rescued from the wreckage all those years ago, but the remarkable woman she'd become. Strong, brilliant, compassionate, and undeniably the most important person in his life. No, he said finally. I'm not. Before he could second-guess himself, Kale leaned forward and gently took Lyra's hand in his. The contact sent a current of awareness through him, heightened perhaps by her sylvan empathic abilities or simply by the significance of the moment. I've been afraid, he admitted, the words difficult after so many years of emotional restraint. Not of what I feel for you, but of destroying what we already have. You are the most important person in my life, Lyra. The thought of losing you, of ruining what we've built together. Some things need to change to grow, Lyra said softly, her fingers tightening around his. Like the ship, we had to rebuild it to save it. The metaphor struck Kale as perfectly apt. Their relationship, like the rust bucket, had reached a point where maintenance of the status quo was no longer viable. Adaptation was necessary for survival. With careful gentleness, mindful of her still recovering state, Kale reached out to touch the side of Lyra's face. Her bioluminescence rippled at the contact, colors shifting in response to emotions too complex for words. I don't want to go back to how things were, he said quietly, but moving forward terrifies me. Not because of what you are or who you are, but because I've spent so long protecting myself from this kind of vulnerability. I know, Lyra said, leaning slightly into his touch. I felt your fear, your caution, but I've also felt what's beneath it. Her crown feathers extended fully, their delicate filaments catching the dim light of her quarters. Sylvans don't just perceive emotions, Kale. We respond to them. What I feel for you, it grew naturally over time. It wasn't sudden or confusing for me the way it seems to have been for you. The revelation shouldn't have surprised Kale, yet somehow it did. How long, he asked. A small smile touched Lyra's lips. I'm not sure exactly. It changed gradually, but I became aware of it about a year ago when we were stranded in the asteroid field near Cygnus. Remember? You stayed awake for 3 straight days recalibrating the navigation system so we could find a safe path out. Kale remembered. It had been a grueling ordeal, one of many close calls they'd survived together. Why didn't you say anything? For the same reasons you didn't, Lyra replied simply. Fear of changing what we had. Uncertainty about your feelings. And her bioluminescence dimmed slightly. The knowledge that humans often see my kind as alien, as too different. The admission pained Kale. Had she truly believed he might reject her based on her species? But then, hadn't his own internal struggles circled around the differences between them, the initial roles they played in each other's lives? You are different, he acknowledged. But that difference has never diminished you in my eyes. If anything, it's part of what makes you, you. He struggled to find the right words, wishing he possessed even a fraction of her natural eloquence. And whatever you are, whoever you are, you're the person I want beside me. Not just as crew or student or friend, but as partner, Lyra supplied when he faltered. In every sense. Yes, Kale agreed, the word emerging with quiet certainty. In every sense. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Despite her exhaustion, Lyra's bioluminescence brightened, reflecting emotions that transcended the need for words. With slow deliberation, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration of new territory. Kale was acutely aware of the differences between them. Her skin slightly cooler than human norm, the subtle luminescence visible even through closed eyelids. But these differences felt precious rather than alienating. When they parted, the look in Lyra's eyes, wonder mixed with a profound contentment, mirrored what Kale felt in his own heart. "Rest now," he said softly, aware that despite the emotional significance of the moment, Lyra was still dangerously depleted from her efforts to save the ship. "We have time." She nodded, settling back on her bunk, but kept hold of his hand. "Stay," she asked, the simple request laden with meaning beyond the immediate context. "Always," Kale replied, understanding she was asking for more than just his presence in that moment. She was asking for commitment, for certainty that what had just transpired wasn't merely a product of their near-death experience, but the beginning of something lasting. He settled beside her bunk, their joined hands a bridge between them, as Lyra's exhaustion finally claimed her. As her breathing deepened into sleep, Kale found himself studying her face, noting the delicate patterns of bioluminescence that continued even in unconsciousness, the subtle movements of her crown feathers that somehow communicated more than human expressions ever could. The path ahead would not be simple. They would face practical challenges, the reaction of others to their unconventional relationship, the biological and cultural differences they would need to navigate, the adjustment to new dynamics after years of established patterns. But in that quiet moment, watching over Lyra as she slept, Kale felt a certainty that had eluded him for decades. Whatever challenges came, they would face them together, stronger for the bond between them. With that thought providing unexpected peace, Kale allowed himself to rest as well, his hands still joined with Lyra's as the rust bucket carried them steadily toward Pelion Outpost and whatever future awaited them there. The journey to Pelion Outpost took longer than anticipated. Despite their impressive repairs, the rust bucket's engines could maintain only a fraction of their normal output, stretching what should have been a 30-hour journey into nearly 50. During that time, Kale and Lyra focused primarily on keeping the ship functioning, taking turns monitoring the fragile systems and making adjustments as needed. Yet between these necessary tasks, something new blossomed. Free from the constraints of unacknowledged feelings, they discovered a different kind of partnership, one that maintained the foundation of trust and respect they'd built over years, but allowed for a depth of connection neither had previously permitted themselves. The changes were subtle at first. Conversations that had grown strained now flowed naturally again, but with an added layer of openness. Physical proximity, once carefully managed, became comfortable and frequent. A hand on a shoulder during system checks, fingers brushing while sharing meals, the casual intimacy of shared space without the underlying tension that had plagued them in recent months. More significant were the quiet moments between crises, when Lyra would share memories of her childhood before captivity, or Kale would finally speak of his military past, the losses that had driven him to isolation. Stories neither had been willing to revisit before now served as bridges, connecting their separate histories into a shared understanding. By the time Pelion Outpost appeared on their view screen, a sprawling industrial complex orbiting a mineral-rich planetoid, the rust bucket was functioning on little more than determination and constant maintenance. Its thrusters sputtered as Kale guided it into the designated docking bay, the final maneuvers requiring all his considerable skill. The docking clamps engaged with a shuddering finality that seemed to echo through the ship. For several moments, Kale and Lyra sat in silence at their respective stations, the sudden absence of engine noise almost disorienting after days of constant vigilance. "We made it," Lyra said finally, her voice soft with disbelief. Kale nodded, the tension of the past days releasing in a long exhale. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to us," she corrected gently, rising from her station to join him. Her bioluminescence had recovered much of its normal vibrancy, though she still moved with the caution of someone conserving energy. As they prepared to disembark, Cale found himself unexpectedly hesitant. On the rust bucket, they existed in their own world with their own rules and understandings. Stepping onto Pelion meant facing external realities again, the curious or judgmental gazes of others, the practical concerns of resupply and repairs, the inevitable questions about their unconventional partnership. Sensing his hesitation, Lyra touched his arm. "What is it?" Cale gestured vaguely at the airlock. "Out there, it's different. People will see us differently." Understanding dawned in Lyra's eyes. "You're worried about how others will perceive us." "Not for my sake," Cale clarified quickly. "I stopped caring about others' opinions a long time ago. But for you, interspecies relationships aren't exactly common, especially with our particular history. People might be cruel." Lyra's crown feathers shifted in a pattern Cale recognized as amused affection. "Cale, I'm a Sylvan who spent years in captivity before being rescued by a gruff human salvager. I faced far worse than curious stares or disapproving comments." Her perspective, as always, provided clarity. Cale smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Fair point. Besides," she added, her bioluminescence shifting to a warm, confident glow, "what matters is what we know to be true. The rest is just background noise." With that settled, they disembarked, stepping onto Pelion Outpost's main concourse. The station hummed with the activity typical of industrial outposts, traders haggling over rare minerals, maintenance crews moving between docking bays, administrative personnel managing the complex logistics of deep space commerce. After days in the comparative quiet of their damaged ship, the noise and energy were almost overwhelming. Their immediate priorities were clear: secure maintenance services for the rust bucket, arrange temporary accommodations while repairs were underway, and resupply their depleted stores. Cale had docked at Pelion occasionally over the years and had established contacts that would facilitate these necessities, even if their credits were running low after the disastrous military outpost venture. "I know someone in maintenance who owes me a favor," Cale explained as they made their way through the crowded concourse. "Should be able to get priority service, maybe even a discount." Lyra nodded, though Cale noticed she was receiving more attention than usual. Her sylvan features always attracted curious glances. Her species was rare in this sector, but something about her seemed to draw particular notice today. It took Cale a moment to realize why. She wasn't attempting to dim her bioluminescence or keep her crown feathers flattened as she typically did in public settings. Instead, she moved with a new confidence, her natural luminescence flowing in gentle patterns, her crown fully extended. The sight filled Cale with unexpected pride. For years, Lyra had deliberately minimized her most distinctive sylvan traits when among strangers, a habit born of her time in captivity when standing out meant drawing unwanted attention. This small but significant change spoke volumes about her growing self-acceptance. Their first stop was the station's main administrative office, where they registered their arrival and filed the necessary reports about their damaged vessel. The clerk, a middle-aged human woman with the efficient manner of someone who had processed thousands of similar cases, barely looked up from her terminal as she input their information. "Salvage vessel Rust Bucket, registered owner Cale Maddox, crew of 2, she recited, fingers flying over the interface. "Purpose of visit: emergency repairs and resupply," Cale replied. "We sustained significant damage during an operation and barely made it here." The clerk nodded absently, still focused on her screen. "Standard docking fees apply regardless of vessel condition. Maintenance services can be arranged through bay control. Temporary accommodations are available in Sector 4. Will you require medical services as well?" Before Cale could answer, the clerk finally looked up, her gaze falling on Lyra. Her professional demeanor faltered momentarily as she registered the Sylvan's appearance. "Oh, I didn't realize." She glanced between Cale and Lyra, clearly reassessing the situation. "We don't often see Sylvans here. Is there any special accommodation your colleague requires?" The slight hesitation before colleague was subtle but unmistakable, a question within a question, probing the nature of their relationship. Partner, Cale corrected firmly. And no, no special accommodations necessary. The clerk's eyes widened slightly at the deliberate clarification, but to her credit, she recovered quickly. Of course. Partner, my apologies. She completed the registration with renewed efficiency. You're cleared for 30 standard days. Maintenance estimates and accommodation options will be transmitted to your personal devices. As they left the administrative office, Lyra's bioluminescence rippled with amusement. That was interesting. Was it too direct? Cale asked, suddenly concerned he might have overstepped. They had acknowledged their feelings for each other, but hadn't explicitly discussed how they would present their relationship to others. It was perfect, Lyra assured him, her crowned feathers shifting in pleasure. Just unexpected, in a good way. The rest of the day passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Cale's contact and maintenance, a grizzled engineer named Jorvin, inspected the rust bucket with professional interest, clearly impressed by the improvised repairs that had kept it functional. Never seen anything like it, he admitted, examining one of Lyra's Sylvan-enhanced connections. These shouldn't work at all, but somehow they're holding. How did you manage it? Lyra exchanged a smile with Cale before responding. Let's just say I have a way with machines. Jorvin gave her an appraising look, clearly recognizing there was more to the story, but didn't press further. Well, whatever your secret, it saved your lives. But these fixes won't hold forever. You're looking at a major overhaul if you want this ship fully operational again. The cost estimate made Cale wince. Even with Jorvin's professional discount, the repairs would consume most of their remaining credits. But there was no alternative. The rust bucket wasn't just their livelihood, it was their home. How long? Cale asked. Jorvin consulted his diagnostic pad. 3 weeks, minimum. Possibly longer, depending on parts availability. 3 weeks. The longest they'd been grounded in years. Cale glanced at Lyra, gauging her reaction. To his surprise, she didn't seem concerned by the extended delay. That's actually not so bad, she said thoughtfully. We could use the downtime. With repairs arranged, they secured temporary quarters in Sector 4, a small but functional apartment typically rented to visiting traders. The space was sparse compared to the personalized comfort of the rust bucket, but it offered amenities their ship currently lacked. Reliable environmental controls, uninterrupted power, and perhaps most appreciated, proper bathing facilities. I never thought a shower could feel this good, Lyra declared later that evening, emerging from the small bathroom with her crowned feathers glistening with moisture. Her bioluminescence pulsed with contentment as she settled beside Cale on the room's single couch. Cale smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The gesture still felt new, a conscious action rather than the automatic familiarity it would eventually become, but the rightness of it was undeniable. So, he said, 3 weeks on Pelion. Any thoughts on how we should spend the time? Lyra leaned into his embrace, her subtle, alien scent, something like ozone and flowering plants, mingling with the standard recycled air of the station. Besides monitoring the repairs, I have a few ideas. There was a note in her voice that Cale hadn't heard before, playful, slightly mischievous, and undeniably inviting. He turned to look at her, finding her eyes already on his, luminescent and filled with an emotion that sent warmth spreading through his chest. Care to share these ideas? He asked, his voice dropping lower. In response, Lyra shifted closer, eliminating the small space that remained between them. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the quickened beat of his heart beneath her palm. I think, she said softly, that we have 3 weeks to explore all the things we've been avoiding, all the possibilities we've been too afraid to acknowledge. Her bioluminescence intensified, reflecting the depth of emotion behind her words. I think it's time we stop being cautious, Cale. The invitation was unmistakable. For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered through Cale, not about his feelings or desires, but about the practical realities of their physiological differences. As if sensing his thoughts, Lyra smiled. We're compatible in more ways than you might think, she said, answering his unspoken question. Sylvans and humans have more similarities than differences, especially where it matters. The gentle teasing in her voice dissolved the last of Kale's hesitation. With deliberate tenderness, he cradled her face in his hands, marveling at the subtle luminescence that intensified at his touch. "I've been cautious all my life," he admitted. "It's kept me alive, but it's also kept me from living. I don't want that anymore. Not with you." Their second kiss was different from the first, less tentative, more certain. What began as gentle exploration quickly deepened into something more profound, a physical expression of emotions too complex for words. Lyra's bioluminescence responded to each touch, creating patterns of light that seemed to flow between them, adding a dimension to intimacy that Kale had never experienced before. They discovered each other slowly, with care and occasional laughter as they navigated their differences. Lyra's crown feathers proved unexpectedly sensitive, while certain patterns traced along her bioluminescent skin elicited responses that delighted them both. In turn, she explored Kale with the fascinating perspective of someone encountering human physiology as a new territory, appreciative, curious, and intuitive in ways that left him breathless. What could have been awkward or uncertain instead became a journey of mutual discovery, each moment building on the trust and connection they'd established over years of shared experience. By the time they lay tangled together in the apartment's single bed, both exhausted and exhilarated, the last barriers between them had fallen away. "I never imagined," Kale said softly, tracing patterns along Lyra's arm where her bioluminescence still pulsed with afterglow, "that finding you in that wreckage would lead to this." Lyra smiled, her crown feathers gently brushing his cheek as she nestled closer. "I did," she admitted. "Not immediately, of course. But as I grew older, as we built our life together on the rust bucket, I started to hope." She paused, her gaze turning reflective. The Sylvan concept of fate is different from the human one. We believe connections between souls exist before they're recognized consciously, that certain beings are drawn together for reasons beyond coincidence. "You think that's what happened with us?" Kale asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I think," Lyra said thoughtfully, "that of all the wrecks in all the junkyards and all the Outer Rim, you found me. What are the chances of that? Of all the salvagers who might have come across that ship, it was you. Someone with enough compassion to help a frightened alien child, enough patience to teach her, enough courage to eventually see her as she truly is." Her bioluminescence brightened. "Call it fate or extraordinary luck, the result is the same. We found each other." The simple truth of her words resonated deeply with Kale. Whatever forces had brought them together, chance, fate, or some combination of the two, he could no longer imagine his life without Lyra in it. What had begun as an impulsive act of rescue had evolved into the most significant relationship of his life, transforming him as surely as it had transformed her. "We did," he agreed, pulling her closer. "And I'm never letting go." The 3 weeks on Pelion passed with surprising speed. Days were filled with practical matters, overseeing repairs to the rust bucket, securing new salvage contracts for when they were space-worthy again, replenishing supplies, while nights were devoted to each other, exploring their new relationship with the same thoroughness they applied to salvage operations. They also began to establish how they would present themselves to the outside world. Neither was particularly concerned with others' opinions, but the practical realities of an interspecies relationship in the Outer Rim required some consideration. Some environments would be more accepting than others. Some contacts might need to be approached with caution. To Kale's surprise, the reactions they encountered on Pelion were largely neutral or positive. The industrial outpost had seen enough of the galaxy's diversity that a human-Sylvan partnership, while unusual, didn't provoke the negative attention he had feared. If anything, Lyra's obvious abilities and intelligence earned her respect from the station's engineering community, particularly after word spread of her role in saving the rust bucket. One evening, as the repairs neared completion, they sat in one of Pelion's observation lounges, watching ships arrive and depart against the backdrop of stars. The lounge was moderately crowded, but they had secured a quiet corner table where they could talk privately. "I've been thinking," Lyra said, her fingers intertwined with Kale's on the table between them, about our future operations. Kale raised an eyebrow. Oh, the military outpost job was a disaster, she continued, but the concept had merit. Higher risk, higher reward. We have skills and capabilities that most salvage teams don't. My Sylvan abilities, your military background. We could specialize in more challenging recoveries. The suggestion was logical. Their unique combination of talents did position them well for more specialized work. But Kale couldn't help feeling a twinge of concern. Those operations are riskier, he pointed out. What happened at the outpost could happen again, or worse. Lyra's bioluminescence pulsed thoughtfully. Yes, but we'd be more prepared. And the financial rewards would mean we could upgrade the rust bucket properly, not just patch it together. Better shields, improved navigation systems, enhanced stealth capabilities. You've given this a lot of thought, Kale observed. I have, Lyra admitted. But it's not just about the practical benefits. She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. It's about building something together, Kale. Not just continuing as we have been, but creating something new. A future that reflects what we've become to each other. Put that way, the proposal took on greater significance. It wasn't merely a business decision, but a statement of partnership, of shared vision. And Kale had to admit the challenge appealed to him. The routine salvage operations that had once provided comfortable isolation now seemed increasingly inadequate compared to the possibilities Lyra was suggesting. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. When the rust bucket is ready, we'll start looking for those specialized contracts. Lyra's smile and the brightening of her bioluminescence were reward enough for the decision. But beneath his agreement lay a deeper commitment to building a life together that honored both their pasts and their shared future, whatever challenges that might entail. 3 days later, they stood in the docking bay, watching as the final external repairs were completed on the rust bucket. The ship looked better than it had in years, its hull panels properly matched for once, its systems upgraded beyond mere functionality to something approaching optimal performance. She's beautiful, Lyra said softly, genuine affection in her voice. Kale nodded in agreement. The rust bucket had been his home and livelihood for 15 years, but only in the past 3, since finding Lyra, had it truly felt like a home rather than merely a refuge. Now, with their relationship transformed and their professional goals aligned, the ship represented something new. Not an escape from the past, but a vessel carrying them toward a shared future. The repair chief, a taciturn Rigelian with more mechanical appendages than organic ones, approached with a final diagnostic pad. All systems green, he reported. Environmental controls operating at 98% efficiency. Main engines at full capacity. Shield generators upgraded as requested. She's ready to fly. Kale accepted the pad, reviewing the extensive list of repairs and upgrades with a mixture of satisfaction and slight disbelief at the final cost. It had consumed nearly all their remaining credits, but the investment would pay dividends in terms of safety and capabilities. Thank you, he said, returning the pad. You and your team did exceptional work. The Rigelian made a gesture that might have been a shrug. Interesting project. Your preliminary repairs were unconventional, effective, but unconventional. His gaze shifted to Lyra, mechanical eyes whirring as they adjusted focus. If you ever consider a career change, Sylvan, I could use someone with your insights on my team. Lyra smiled politely. I appreciate the offer, but I'm exactly where I want to be. After completing the final authorization, they were cleared for departure. As they boarded the rust bucket, the familiar surroundings felt simultaneously unchanged and entirely different. The same spaces now viewed through the lens of their evolved relationship. They moved through their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, the routine comfortable yet charged with new energy. When all was ready, Kale glanced at Lyra in the co-pilot's seat beside him. Where to? He asked, though they had already discussed their next destination, a space station near the Cygnus border with a coordinator known for specialized salvage operations. Lyra smiled, understanding the deeper question beneath the practical one. Forward, she said simply. Together. Kale returned her smile, feeling a sense of rightness settle over him. With Lyra beside him and the stars ahead, the path forward, once so uncertain, now seemed clear. Not easy, perhaps, but clear. Together, he agreed, engaging the launch sequence. The rust bucket lifted smoothly from the docking bay, its engines humming with renewed power as it carried them back into the vast expanse of space. As Pelion receded behind them, Kale reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter in a wreckage to an unbreakable bond forged through years of shared experiences, mutual growth, and finally, acknowledged love. In salvaging Lyra from that crashed ship, he had unwittingly salvaged himself from a life of isolation. And in the pieces of their separate pasts, they had built something neither could have anticipated, but both now cherished beyond measure. A future, reclaimed from the scrap heap of chance and circumstance, transformed into something precious and enduring. The navigation console beeped softly, confirming their course to the Cygnus border. Beside him, Lyra's bioluminescence pulsed in harmony with the ship's systems, her crown feathers extended in contentment. Outside the viewport, stars streaked past as they accelerated to cruising speed, an infinity of possibilities stretching before them. "Ready for our next adventure?" Kale asked, reaching over to take her hand. Lyra's fingers interlaced with his, her touch both alien and intimately familiar. "Always," she replied, her voice warm with promise. "Always."